It was a morning to be remembered. The ground was covered in snow, and the wind was cold, bitterly cold, as we stepped off the train that spring morning in 1893. This was Blackfoot Station, Montana, a small place. The town consisted of less than half a dozen homes. There was no hotel and no living accommodations. Our journey to Montana was ended, but our new life among the Piegan people was about to begin. Yes, it was a morning long to be remembered.
Eugene Ziegel Dutcher grew up on a farm in Floyd County, Iowa, where his family belonged to the Methodist Episcopal Church. He attended college and became a teacher. In November 1886, Gene wrote a letter to his mother saying, "I have been converted to God." This awareness of a Christian life came to him while attending some meetings. Mary Bishop grew up in Iowa and Kansas. Her mother came from a Quaker home and passed on to Mary that practice of a quiet Christian religious life. Mary attended McPherson Normal College, a school of the Church of the Brethren. Gene and Mary were teachers at different schools, but in the same general area in northern Kansas. They both boarded at homes in the district. Gene wrote to his mother about his school and about visiting Mary in a letter postmarked January 7th, 1888. They were married August 5th, 1888, at Republican City, Nebraska, when Mary was 20 years old and Gene was 25. Bishop Foss, called Foss, was born on May 15th, 1889, and Edith Louisa was born November 24th, 1891. Gene was ordained a minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church and received his local preacher's license December 22nd, 1888, from Ash Creek Circuit of the West Nebraska Annual Conference. In 1890, he answered a call from the Methodist Mission in Arizona to work among the Navajo. We are not sure if Mary was with him at that time. It would have been shortly after Foss was born. However, they were both at Fort Lewis, Colorado in late 1891 and 1892.
For a few years now, our attention has been turned toward the plight of the Indians. Mr. Dutcher went in response to a call from our Methodist mission in Arizona. At this place he built a parsonage, visited Indians, held religious services, and did the many, many little things necessary to the founding of the mission. The first thing to be done was, of course, to get the consent of the Indians to build a building on their reservation. To do this, it was necessary to visit 2 or 3 chiefs of the tribe, and especially the war chief. His place of abode was some 60 miles distant, so with interpreter and guide, Mr. Dutcher started on what some said was a very doubtful accomplishment, as this old chief was very surly and not easily approached on such business. However, when Mr. Dutcher arrived, he was warmly received. The Navajo call him Good Longcoat. After 2 or 3 such trips, all arrangements were completed, and our initial work there among the Navajos still go on. Our next field was in southwest Colorado among the Apaches, Utes, and Navajo, under the auspices of the Department of Interior, United States Indian Service. Mr. Dutcher taught at the Fort Lewis Missionary School, and I worked in the hospital.
While they were at Fort Lewis, Gene received a letter from Mrs. A.S. Quinton, president of the Women's National India Association, asking him and Mary to consider going to Montana on behalf of the WNIA. The WNIA was founded in 1879 and was united against the encroachment of white settlers on land set aside for the Native Americans. The group maintained missions, produced publications, and influenced public opinion. At its height, the WNIA had 60 branch organizations in 27 states.
September 28, 1891. Reverend Mr. Dutcher, dear sir and brother, having just had a conference with Dr. and Mrs. Dorchester, I write to ask whether you would consider a call to go as a missionary of our association or one of its state societies to a tribe in Montana next spring, and whether your wife would also, if the way opens, become our missionary. You may remember that we met at Fort Defiance last June, and Dr. D tells me of your present work, and that you might like this work as well. We expect to build a cottage in the spring, and a chapel we hope later. Our workers would have the house rent-free. We pay $1,000 to a man and his wife if both are our missionaries. May I hear from you soon, after which I can write more fully. In haste, yours sincerely, Mrs. Amelia Stone Quinton, President, Women's National Indian Association.
The Brooklyn and Bay Bridge branches of the WNIA began gathering money in 1886 to acquire a parcel of land in order to establish a Christian mission among the Piegan in Montana. In 1891, 160 acres of reservation land adjoining the Indian Agency boarding school was purchased to establish this mission on the banks of Willow Creek.
On April 3, 1893, we arrived at Blackfoot Station on the Great Northern Railroad. This is about in the center of the Blackfeet Indian Reservation and is the historic homeland of the Blackfeet. There was no hotel and no living accommodations. However, we succeeded in getting breakfast at the section house near the depot. An Indian was found who would take us to what would be our home at Willow Creek, some 8 or 10 miles distant from the station. On arriving at the little log cabin, we found it still occupied by the family who had just been its owners. We then were compelled to go to the Indian school and seek food and shelter until this family could build another cabin and move into it. This required about 2 weeks, at the end of which time we took ourselves and trunks and began housekeeping. For some time our only piece of furniture was a cook stove. To buy anything aside from common groceries, we had to send to Helena or other places, which were hundreds of miles from us. In a few days, however, Mr. Dutcher had several of the small necessary articles of furniture manufactured from rough boards. This answered until we could enlarge the house and get settled.
The log cabin provided by the WNIA was a 16-foot square with a dirt roof. Gene put his carpentry skills to work and soon built an addition to the cabin. So there were 3 comfortable rooms. In time, the family's furniture from Nebraska arrived, and they settled in very nicely. Eventually, Gene built a buggy shed and stable, along with a large storeroom to the house.
The first summer was a very busy season for us. We did all kinds of work and got acquainted with the Indians. In short, we took in the situation and prepared to work in a way to accomplish the best results. The Piegan Indians, with whom our work is connected, are all part of the famous Blackfoot tribe. They number a little less than 2,000, of whom about a quarter are mixed bloods. At one time food and clothing were the fruits of the chase, but buffalo became more and more scarce, and the white man with his civilization and firewater became more plentiful. The Piegan are receiving rations and annuities from the government now. This comes out of the Indians' own money, which is held to their credit at Washington for land which the U.S. has bought of them, and does not come from taxpayers, as so many people think. They have many horses, and they own many head of cattle. Each individual has his own and cares for them. As yet they are not allowed to kill or sell any without consent of the Indian agent, but after they have built up their herds and learned the use and value of them, there will be no need for this restriction. The Piegan are now undergoing a great change. We are here to help them in whatever way we can, to bring them up to a better life which should make them fit subjects for citizenship in our United States.
At this time, the Indian agent had absolute control of the reservation, subject only to the approval of the Department of Interior. No Indian could receive food, obtain a tool, or live in his home unless the agent was willing. Agents received little compensation for the never-ending worries and details that came with their position. Unfortunately, many were weak-minded men who soon succumbed to the temptations of diverting cattle or selling off goods to whites that were meant to support the Indians. In addition, the hustlers and exploiters have arrived in Montana, and all these individuals are struggling among themselves for the reservation resources. The current agent, George Steele, stays mostly on his cattle ranch. He is a morphine addict, and when he does come to the agency, he speaks to the Indians through a 12 by 12 opening in the door.
It was important to speak to the Piegan about establishing our mission work. A council of Indians was called, requested by Mr. Dutcher to secure their consent for us to live on their reservation. All the chiefs except one signed the necessary documents. This one, White Calf, by name, refused to do so on the ground that the Indian agent did not ask him first. We know that White Calf was recognized as one of the most influential men in the tribe. Mr. Dutcher took pains to explain our object, and White Calf was soon convinced of our good intentions. He has never ceased to apologize to us for his seemingly unwelcome action. The Piegans soon saw we were not Catholics, but they did not know anything about the Protestants as a church. They asked why Mr. Dutcher did not wear a robe when he preached, and some called him the priest with a wife. They have watched us closely from the beginning, and why should they not when they have had so much trickery practiced upon them?
As Jean and Mary went about their work establishing the mission and getting acquainted with the Indians, they were being closely watched, not only by the Indians, but by local white settlers, ranchers, and Indian agent.
Reverend E.S. Dutcher and wife have established a permanent Protestant mission at Willow Creek. Dutcher is busily engaged in completing a residence for himself and family. A chapel is to be erected soon. January 1894, report to the U.S. Department of Interior. George Steele, agent.
The Piegans build neat log cabins of 2 and 3 rooms each and cover them with lumber and dirt. A large number of them have board floors. I know one woman who sewed together gunny sacks and fastened them down very neatly with wooden pegs for a carpet over the dirt floor. Sheds and stables are also made of logs covered with brush and dirt and chinked with mud to keep out the snow in the winter. Some whitewash their houses both on the in and the outside. Each family has a teepee or circular tent that can always be seen pitched near the cabin, unless they are gone from home when it is taken along for shelter at night or to be used in case of storm. How do they dress? Is so often asked me. Nearly all of them like white people. The men all wear what we call citizens' clothes, unless it be on some extra occasion when a few may fix up in Indian style, or in very cold weather, when they put a blanket around them over their overcoats. This is commendable in a country where the mercury falls 60 degrees below zero at times. The women do not adhere quite so closely to our fashions as do the men. Perhaps half dress and try to look like white women as near as possible. Many women would gladly come over to our ways were it not for the fact that some of the tribe would laugh at them. They cannot bear ridicule. For an Indian couple to marry, it is necessary to obtain the agent's consent, which he gives in writing, and then they may have either the priest or the Protestant minister to perform the ceremony. No Indian is allowed to have more than one wife except the very old men, who have always had several. They are permitted to keep them. This is to keep the old mischief makers in good humor, while the work of civilization is being thoroughly established in other ways. It is impossible to bring them to perfection all at once. As a people, they are very religious in their own way of belief. They have many gods, a god for nearly everything, a god to pray to for health, a god to give them food, etc. They must go through one kind of ceremony to please a certain god, and through some other to please a different one. Catholicism has been in that Northwest country for 40 years, so that they have a great deal of that mixed in with their own superstitions, and a bad mixture it is. Our first Christmas service, December 1893, was held in our cottage, as at the time the church was not built. We had only 3 rooms. We arranged 2 Christmas trees for the Indian children, giving them more than 200 presents, which has been sent us by friends in the East. Mr. Dutcher told the wonderful story of Christ's birth through an interpreter. The house was more than full. The Piegans brought their teepees and made their camps around the mission. It was very cold outside, but those who could not sit or stand inside stood looking through the windows.
Mary assisted Gene in his duties as much as she could, but she was also responsible for the housekeeping, cooking, and the care and schooling of 2 young and energetic children. Mary also suffered from migraine headaches. Foss and Edith had lessons at home, but attended Sunday school with the Indian children. They had a pet swan and a dog named Bounce. Mary's mother, Edith Bishop, worried that Mary had taken on too much and expressed her concern in a letter.
Mary, don't neglect your own children for those little Indians. It made me feel real bad when you wrote that you locked them in the room while you were sick. I wish you had left Foss with me. I'm glad to hear you are well now and hope you may keep so, but I am afraid you have taken too much of a task on yourself. I am afraid Foss will get sore eyes. Write as soon as you can. Kiss the baby for me. Mother.
Gene had annual conferences to attend for the North Montana Mission. At the conference, August 30th, 1893, in Bozeman, Gene receives his deacon and elder credentials. He attended this meeting alone, but in 1894 the whole family, including Luzetta and a Mrs. Poole, attended the annual conference in Bozeman. They traveled by wagon and camped out along the way. As early as possible in 1894, ground was broken for the new Epsworth Piegan Mission Chapel. The chapel was to be 26 by 45 feet in size, large enough to seat 200. The WNIA had provided $500 for the building of the chapel, but that was not enough money. Gene's parents, Newman and Mary Dutcher, were visiting friends in Iowa when he wrote his father.
Say, what is the matter with you asking some of those people there to contribute toward our chapel fund? Anything from 5 cents to $500 will be accepted. We need a chapel very badly. I believe the Sunday school there ought to give something. Tell them so. Let the people in our school district know that we need funds. It may be they will help. Tell everybody what we need and let them send forth their portion. Please excuse me for asking you to enlist in the cause of home missions, but don't let this apology keep you from enlisting. Your son, Gene.
The second year of our work, we built a chapel. The ladies of Brooklyn furnished us with $500 towards the building, but it was not enough. We asked whites who lived on the reservation, government employees, and railroad employees, and Indians to add to this amount. They did so in the amount of $300. When our carload of lumber was set off on the side track 3 miles from the mission, 17 teams driven by Indians came to haul it to the building spot free of charge. When the wagons were all unloaded, we invited them in to a splendid dinner of vegetables, milk, butter, etc., all of which we produced there at the mission. When the church was being built, several donated work, and then when the chairs were to be put in, we had still more assistance. One evening at dusk, 3 full-blood young Indian men came to our cottage and said they would help put the chairs together that evening. We said, "All right," and at once lighted the church and began carrying the bundles of chairs from the shed 8 or 10 rods distant to the church. One of these young men is a good mechanic and as quick as a cat. In little more than 2 hours we had those 200 chairs brought from the shed and put together. Of course, I did not do much except cut the strings which held the bundles together. We then retired to the dining room for some refreshments. I had put the coffee pot on the stove before beginning, knowing full well by that time how the Indians like coffee.
Education for the Piegans was provided by 2 schools, each having a capacity of 125 pupils. One was the regular government school, and the other a contract school managed by the Catholics. The Willow Creek Government School was located on land adjacent to the mission and had been in operation for about 10 years. This was the period of forced acculturation, where the government wanted the Indian to be made over in the image of white society. To this end, Indian children of all ages were taken from their parents and placed in the government boarding schools, where the Indian life was trained out of them. School was held 10 months of the year, and the children were only allowed to go home to their parents during vacations and holidays. A deep sense of kinship and family loyalty was an important part of the Piegan social organization. Piegan children were loved and treasured. It was particularly difficult for parents to let their children go to the boarding school and not be able to see them daily. However, since once Sunday school began at the mission, Indian parents found a way around the government restriction. The agent encouraged Sunday school attendance because this prevented the children from idling about the agency on the Sabbath.
The Indian children come from a body from the government school to our Sunday school. While we often had Indian visitors during the week, we soon found that on Sundays our cottage would be overflowing with guests. The parents had come to see their school children. I always make sure to have coffee and some little refreshment for our visitors. When they visit us, we meet them in our best room, give them the rocking chairs, have them sit with us at our own table, and treat them as good as we would you, should you visit us, because they are our brothers. We have the same Heavenly Father, and He loves them as much as He does you and me.
Dutcher was well equipped to survive the frustrations of life on the reservation, and he was ably assisted by his long-suffering wife. His conception of the mission's goals very closely followed the ideology of the time, civilization and Christianization. To Dutcher, civilization primarily meant education and the acquisition of a Protestant work ethic expressed in an agricultural setting. He used the familiar device of the demonstration farm, designed to be an industrial object lesson to the Indian and a place where the pure and simple truths of the gospel are taught. Howard L. Harrod, author and historian, Missions Among the Blackfeet.
Jean and Mary were able to translate the first part of this purpose into reality. They dug an irrigation system and put it in a sizable garden. Jean was a vigorous farmer, and his agricultural yield was phenomenal. In 1 year, he produced 12,000 pounds of potatoes, 3,000 pounds of rutabagas, 1,000 pounds of turnips, 150 heads of cabbage, and 50 pounds of beets in the mission garden.
We have a large garden which we irrigate from a ditch which we made ourselves. Mr. Dutcher did the surveying and I set the stakes. Then we plowed it out. We had a pony team that did not know anything about plowing, so it was an irksome task. Mr. D would hold the plow and I tried to drive, then vice and versa. Finally, after a good deal of patience and perseverance, we had a good large ditch. We teach by precept and example both. We want the pagan to know how to make homes and to share the joy of a life beyond. We believe the soul can be better ministered unto by ministering to the body as well. We visit them in their homes, show and tell them in some cases as we would children how to fix their houses, etc. For instance, Mr. Dutcher sees a man's fence around his garden, and the posts in the corners are not braced in any way. He tells the Indian what should be done and how to do it, and if possible, helps him to do it. In the garden he shows Mr. Dutcher how his beans are planted. He has them buried a foot or more deep. Mr. D tells him this is wrong and why, and proceeds to show him the proper way. Perhaps the next Indian we meet wants to have some help to make a dress, or medicine for a toothache, or wants to get married, or have a child baptized, or a table made, and so on.
There is a practical form of missionary work, seldom seen, which cannot be too highly applauded. I've seen it practiced on the Blackfeet Reservation by the Reverend E.S. Dutcher. This good man preaches on Sunday to those who come to hear him in the little church with his own hands built. And other days of the week he takes his tools, for he has learned a carpenter's trade and goes about over the reservation, helping the Indians to hang the doors and set the window frames in their houses, or to set fence posts, or to stretch the wire for their pasture fences. Often his good wife goes with him, and while he works out the doors with the men, she is busy within, teaching the women how to break good bread or to make the family clothing. Missionary work such as this, where practical religion is made a part of the daily life, and soul and mind and body are cared for at once, accomplish lasting results. George Burr Grinnell, Indian advocate and Blackfeet historian.
Since cash was always short at the mission, Jean marketed his other skills in the newly established village of Browning. The missionary, it was reported, who is a practical mechanic, has earned from doing carpenter work at $4 per day more than $40. The Blackfeet may not have been impressed with the demonstration of the Protestant work ethic, but they did begin to participate in the life of the church. At the first Easter service in April 1894, over 100 Blackfeet and about 20 whites were present at the worship service at the little cottage. 14 children were baptized and 5 persons participated in communion. To close the service, the missionaries took up a collection which amounted to $36.75. Giving religious instruction to children was a task of great importance on the missionary agenda. Even though Gene was busy with his many agricultural projects, he still had time and energy left to pursue programs he considered edifying for the Blackfoot child. After describing a number of his duties, he was quick to add,
While all this work has been done, do not think we have neglected the spiritual interests of the people, for we have maintained a Sunday school since the last Sunday in March 1894, the average attendance of which has been 130.
In our Sunday school, we have the same lessons you have, and at the same time you have them. They learn the subjects, golden texts, etc., and at the end of a quarter there is a large percent of children who can repeat all the subjects and golden texts for the whole year in the regular order. The children can tell you the stories of Moses and Joseph and David and others. They all can repeat the Lord's Prayer, 10 Commandments, and Apostles' Creed, and sing our common hymns until they almost raise the roof. This winter, Mr. Dutcher thought it was time to put religious reading into their hands, as so many of the mixed bloods can read, and also to give the white men who have Indian families wholesome reading. So he began getting subscriptions for 2 or 3 religious papers. Until now, there are over 40 religious papers taken by people on the reservation. Many, many stories and items read from these papers are interpreted and talked about around their campfires.
In July 1894, the mission was transferred from the Women's National Indian Association to the Methodist Episcopal Church and placed under the administration of the Missionary Society. The Epworth Piegan Mission Chapel, as it was now called, was completed in December. The official opening and dedication was held on Sunday, December 23, 1894. Reverend W. W. Van Orsdell, the superintendent of the North Montana Mission, was in attendance.
December 23 was a very busy day at the Epworth Piegan Indian Mission preparing for the Christmas service. It was also the opening of our new church here. Reverend E.S. Dutcher and wife have served here since April 3, 1893. The church is a beauty, modern style, and will seat 200 comfortably. The first service was held in it Sabbath morning, December 23. The morning congregation was made up of the young Indians who had been to school and understood the English language. In the afternoon, the Indians came from far and near, pitching their teepees, prepared to stay. In the evening, Brother Dutcher showed the pictures of the birth and life of Christ with magic lantern, and explained them through an interpreter. On Monday, more Indians came. The morning service lasted until 1 o'clock. During this service, which was through an interpreter, many of the Indians were deeply moved. One of them, a chief and orator, spoke with deep feeling and said he loved Christ and felt that he was a Christian. The 2 o'clock service lasted until 5 and was very impressive. During the service, 4 were baptized. In the evening, 2 large trees, well decorated, graced the church. The congregation was large. The principal chiefs and a number of Indian police were present. The police were doing good service as ushers. Brother Dutcher again showed the pictures and explained them through an interpreter, after which presents were given to 250 different Indians. Christmas was a day of council and work with the Indians. They broke camp and prepared to go to their homes after spending a Merry Christmas at the mission. They were made to feel that they were welcome before going. The leading chiefs came to the cottage to shake hands with Brother and Sister Dutcher and assured them that they had enjoyed themselves and appreciated the interest they had taken in them and in their children. Christmas night, the children of Willow Creek School and the employees came to the chapel together with enough Indians from the outside, some of whom had returned from school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to fill the church, there being over 200 at the service, which opened with several songs well rendered by the Indian children. Brother Dutcher again showed the pictures, delivering the lecture in English to the delight of the children. In all, more than 400 different Indians were at the mission during the opening of this new church and the Christmas services. January 10, 1895, Report to the Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church, Reverend W. W. Van Orsdel, Doctor of Divinity, Superintendent, North Montana Mission.
Although there is little evidence that Gene made a large number of converts to farming, but he did continue his activity undaunted. In 1895, he fenced the mission property and built sheds and a storeroom. He wanted to begin a day school, which he believed was greatly desired by the Blackfeet, but he was never able to realize this. During the next 4 years, he continued his program of civilizing through agriculture, preaching, and instructing the children in religion, assisted by Mary. Politically, this was a time of upheaval on the reservation. Agent Steele was finally reported for his major morphine addiction, and Lorenzo W. Cook became agent 1894 to 1895. Cook criticized the mission irrigation project and was so much opposed to the Blackfeet culture that he threatened to jail women who did beadwork. Former agent Steele befriended Cook and moved his cattle onto reservation land. Steele's herd had gone from 80 head to 400 in 2 years. Cook begins a campaign of driving off the half-breeds and squaw men married to Indian women, from the reservation. Cook leaves for a promotion in the U.S. Army, and Steele is reappointed agent 1895 to 1897. Minerals are thought to be found on the reservation, and 500 people are camped along the border, waiting for homesteading and mining to open. The Glacier National Park sale is completed in spite of many Blackfeet not wanting to sell. Thomas Fuller is appointed agent 1897 to 1898, followed by William Logan 1899 to 1900. Fuller continues the practice of letting cattle ranchers move their herds across the reservation, thereby diverting cattle belonging to the Indians. In 1898, the Indian cows are down to 8,500, over 20,000 the previous year. We don't know how these events affected Gene and Mary, but they must have. They came to Blackfeet country filled with missionary zeal and their hearts and minds open to the Piegan people. In 1899, after what was probably exhausting work among the Piegans, they left the mission buildings and farm to their successor, Reverend Francis Asbury Riggin, and returned to Nebraska. In 1905, the chapel they had built on the banks of Willow Creek was moved to the town of Browning, Montana, where it still serves a Methodist congregation. The original mission cottage has been replaced with a modern house nearer the highway.
These people have been cheated and abused by the whites. When harm has come to the whites, it is invariably claimed the Indians did it. No one asks to what extent the Indians have been vexed and led to strive to hold their own. Duty is on every side. There's so much to be done, and yet so few who are willing to delight in such work. The work has grown that it ranks higher than any other Indian mission of the Methodist Church, and for this we give the women who by work and self-denial furnish the necessary funds, and to the providence of God all the praise. The Lord has been with us, and we have trusted Him for all we need. We feel that it is a great good work, and no one should tire of trying to help those who need help so badly. Their old life is passing away for the Piegans. We are all hastening on toward the great future. Oh, that all people might realize that in heaven there will be no distinction between races of any color, but all the righteous shall stand equally in the sight of God. Let us as white people so humble ourselves that we can feel that all men are our brothers, and that the same gospel is for us all.